My name is Robert Kirkpatrick. I direct the Global Pulse Initiative at the United Nations. I see some who were here the last time at the last strata a year ago, and I know some were surprised at that time to see the UN at a big data conference. We have been doing a lot of things, and I'm going to show you some of what's happened and talk about where we're going next and how you can get involved. Anybody recognize this charming Icelandic volcano? It had the amazing name of Eyjafjallajökull, and it shut down air traffic all across Europe for several weeks. Lots of staff members stranded in places like Paris, unable to get back to work. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that within 4 days of the eruption, 5,000 Kenyan farm workers lost their jobs. Anybody know why? It's flowers. Kenya ships 500 metric tons of fresh flowers to Europe every 24 hours. Right? We live in a world where our transportation systems and our communication systems are now so interconnected that a crisis in one part of the world has impacts everywhere. This kind of condition of hyperconnectivity that we're facing is a very different one than, for example, the UN in 1945 was founded to address. This is a condition where, something happens in one part of the world and it's everywhere in 24 hours. The challenge we face, of course, is that how we track what happens to populations around the world is still stuck back in the 20th century. And we're still using household surveys and collecting statistics every few years to see what's happening. You can see here a chart of how many years out of date the indicators are for progress toward the Millennium Development Goals. The MDG initiative wraps up in 2015. The elephant in the room is we're not actually going to know whether we achieve them all until 2020. So at Global Pulse, we've begun asking the question, if the private sector is able to transform its own operations, is able to monitor emerging trends in the market in real time, and is able to understand feedback from its customers in real time, what patterns appear in this data when people get sick, when they lose their jobs, when they begin struggling for food or medicine? We see in the big data revolution 3 distinct opportunities. The first is better early warning systems. If we can detect anomalies and trends faster, we can respond faster to prevent harm. The second is a more real-time picture of what's actually happening on the ground right now versus knowing right now what began happening 2 or 3 years ago, so that we can plan and implement programs better. And the third point is perhaps the most important. It's real-time feedback. If we can see when what we are doing is not actually working as intended, we can take course correction faster to get results. This is something we haven't seen discussed very much. You hear a lot about big data and privacy, and especially in big data, of course, we're talking about risk of re-identification. There was a project in 2009. A couple of MIT students, as a demonstration project, showed that it was possible to analyze your Facebook profile and tell whether you were gay with about 90% accuracy. Getting outed is bad, but imagine if you're in a country where that's a capital offense. This is a human rights issue, and it's one that we haven't even begun to really come to grips with. At Global Pulse, we've been working for the past 6 months on a set of guidelines for how to use big data safely. We see at present essentially a big data privacy conversation that might be characterized as the EU versus Mark Zuckerberg. Right? You have on the one side, this perspective that privacy is dead and profit is king. And on the other end, you have all reuse is forbidden without my explicit permission. At Global Pulse, we see big data as a raw public good, but it needs to be transformed and safely into a powerful asset for understanding what's happening in the world. But to do that, we have to create a sandbox. We have to create a safe space so that we can experiment with different types of data for specific purposes, while also in parallel developing ways to protect privacy. These are some of the principles that we've been following in our work. Wanted to show you briefly a little of the background research that's out there in the social sciences and much in the private sector in using some of the kinds of big data that we also believe can have a profound impact on how the public sector works. Mobile carriers. Lots of interesting data out there, even if we're not talking about a smartphone with 200 apps on it, even if we're talking about a $20 feature phone. The data that these devices produce is actually quite interesting. Mobile carriers collect call-to-tail records. Even if you look at this data in anonymized form, you can begin to construct a social graph. You can see population movements and plot trajectories across a map in time. And you can also understand patterns of consumption. In the developing world, they don't have postpaid accounts the way we do here in the States. What you have is people, for the most part, buying airtime credit via scratch cards. So there are a lot of different indicators that you can pull out of this data: consumption variables, social variables, and mobility variables. Of course, carriers use this to understand and segment their subscriber base in order to target different services at them. So this data is interesting. The airtime purchases in particular, from a sort of pure economic standpoint. Let's say you have two subscribers, one of whom puts $10 a month on her card at the beginning of the month every month, and the other, maybe he spends $10 a month on communications as well, but he does it in little tiny increments every few days. It's been shown in East Africa that these differences strongly predict household income. You have less cash flow, you don't have the money to put down all at once. Now, it's also interesting because, of course, these patterns can change. If you're monitoring an area where the rains have come late and food prices have increased and you see a population sliding down that curve, that probably means they're in trouble. It doesn't tell you causality. You have to go and find out in the community what's happening. But we think there's a profound opportunity here to understand earlier when communities are under stress. Now, if you're implementing a jobs training program, you would hope to see income increasing. This data is essentially free, and it's real time, and people are already generating it just by using their phones. Turns out how you make calls can also predict your socioeconomic level. When you're poor, people are calling you. They know you can't afford to call them, or you're calling them asking for help. At higher socioeconomic levels, there's more economic activity in your life, so there's more coordination going on, which means something called the reciprocity index increases. This is the likelihood that either you or I will, it's 50% likely to initiate the call. And that's, again, a way to look at the calling patterns and infer just how much economic activity is going on. Sometimes the stereotypes are dead on. Men and women do use their phones differently. This is pretty consistent across a number of countries. But again, think about how expensive it is to go out and do a census and collect information on men and women. It turns out that there are software vendors out there right now who can supply a mobile carrier with algorithms that will detect within a couple of years how old you are from how you use your phone. So this data gets useful very quickly. I mean, what's astonishing is simply the ability, from our perspective, in using mobile data, to be able to see the population in real time. This has never happened before. We can't see people on satellites, but you can see them through a mobile network. This was work that was done after the earthquake in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. There were cholera outbreaks. Those are shown in the areas in black. By working with Digicel, the largest carrier in Haiti, and getting anonymized data on location changes, a group at the Karolinska Institute, now the NGO FlowMinder, was able to plot the areas where the greatest numbers of people whose devices had originally been registered in Port-au-Prince had migrated out of the cholera-stricken areas. They were able to then use this to target where cholera outbreaks were most likely to occur next. This is work done by Telefonica's research arm, unsurprisingly called Telefonica Research. And What they did was a retrospective study of the H1N1 influenza outbreak in Mexico City. As the epidemic rates began to skyrocket, the government put out an announcement telling everyone to stay put. Don't get on the buses, don't get on the trains, don't carry the virus anywhere else. You can see that before that, what they were able to do is essentially calculate a mobility index from the subscriber base. How many different base station transmitters did my device connect with in a 24-hour period? They could see that right before, on April 29th, there was a lot of mobility, but after they made the announcement, people stopped moving around. In other words, they heeded the government instructions. The ability to use this kind of data to track whether a policy initiative is effective is something we're just beginning to explore. Lots of stories like this in the news. In this case, you get a couple of weeks of prediction just by people saying, I think I have the flu. What's particularly interesting, though, is that even if you get it in real time, it's free. Twitter wasn't used in Haiti. Turns out a lot of people were tweeting about their symptoms and they knew they had cholera or a family member did. This study from Harvard's Health Map showed that if, in fact, people had been using Twitter analytics to understand what was happening, they would have been able to detect the cholera outbreaks 2 weeks earlier. Opportunity lost there. And of course, the poster child for this whole vision of services as sensors, Google Flu Trends now has dengue trends, the second disease that they've added. This is search data in Brazil compared to the official outbreak statistics. The first thing we do these days when we get sick is search for symptoms. Global Pulse got interested in HIV last year because this is a case where billions of dollars are going into the fight against HIV/AIDS, and what it's mostly targeted at, besides a vision of a vaccine, is awareness, making people aware of the risk, aware of the availability of testing and counseling. We looked at online chatter through Twitter on World AIDS Day year over year in Indonesia, a very fifth largest user of Twitter in the world, and we found a tripling of conversation about HIV on Twitter year over year, but more significantly, a near doubling of conversation about testing and counseling. Again, you don't know causality, but if I were responsible for a program in Indonesia trying to promote awareness of testing and counseling, that's pretty interesting. A couple of projects that we've worked on since I was last here. Lots of work using social media analytics in the health space. Works pretty well. Lots of work going on in predicting elections. Hasn't really worked so well so far. We wanted to know whether it was possible to use these kinds of approaches to understand when when unemployment spikes were headed our way. So we worked with our partner SAS in this case. We found tens of thousands of blogs all across the United States and Ireland, the two countries that we looked at, where at some point during the period of investigation, people said, I lost my job. I got laid off. I got fired today. And when we compared the volume over time, in this case you can see to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics for unemployment, the curves fit pretty well. Bloggers are a representative sample of the unemployed. So what we then did was apply two different analytical techniques to the online conversation about work before and after people said they lost their jobs. Before, we looked specifically for changes in mood. So we used a mood state classifier to look at work-related conversation. Do we see changes in anxiety, changes in depression, changes in anger related to work, to see if we could predict the unemployment spikes. After people lost their jobs, we looked at clustering of themes, where people were saying, because I lost my job, I can no longer do X. Could we actually use this data to detect the impacts on populations of job loss? So Ireland's pretty interesting. In Ireland, 5 months before you lose your job, there's a spike in anxiety around work. And 2 months after that, we see a spike in the confusion index around work. Something's going on at the office I don't understand. And then people lose their jobs. 3 months after that, they're talking about having to cancel their travel plans, their vacations as a result. In the U.S., it's a completely different picture. We don't get angry, we don't get anxious, and we don't get confused. We get angry and depressed. And it's 4 months before. A different character than the Irish, perhaps. And people lose their jobs, and then what you see is people talking about downgrading their housing and having to take the bus. Now, interesting, in Ireland, you don't see conversations about people losing their houses. Why? Because social protection in Ireland is much better than what we have in the U.S. You're not in danger of losing your house quickly in Ireland the way you are here. But the differences between anxiety and anger, that might well be cultural. We're also very keen to look at Indonesia, a country where Twitter use has absolutely exploded. We wanted to understand, how much conversation there was out there specifically about food. Indonesia is an amazing place to study the use of social media. Jakarta now produces, by some estimates, 9 million tweets a day. That is the tweetingest city on planet Earth. You can tell Indonesians, in Jakarta, natives in particular, spend a lot of time tweeting stuck in traffic. You can almost drive by that map. So lots of content out there. How much is relevant? Well, we found 14 million tweets during the period of investigation related to food, and that was just through October 2011. So Indonesians talk a lot about food. They talk a lot on social media about food. Do they talk differently about food when they're not getting food? Yes. That's the Ramadan fast. So this is something when people are fasting and they're hungry, they talk about it. What's really interesting, though, is that when you compare simply the volume of tweets coming out in the Bahasa language mentioning the words rice and the word price, and compare that to the official food CPI, you start to see correlations emerge. So Global Pulse has been set up in the Secretary General's office essentially as an R&D lab to start experimenting with how these new data sources and new analytical approaches and new technologies can be useful for understanding what's happening to vulnerable populations around the world. Our basic model is this notion of digital services as sensor networks. If we think about a population like many around the world where the rains have come late, food and fuel prices are increasing, populations cope in various ways. They buy cheaper foods, they work longer hours, they try to reduce their consumption. Eventually, they spend their savings and they sell their assets. This is how a crisis drives people into poverty. But this happens beneath the radar of all of the monitoring systems that we use. Right? You often don't know it's happened until it's too late. What's interesting for the first time is the potential to start seeing these digital proxies of coping behavior. People drawing down their airtime credit. In East Africa now, we're seeing a huge explosion in using mobile phones with the M-Pesa mobile money service to repay microloans. Now, if people start defaulting on their microloans, which they worked hard to qualify for, that's probably a bad sign. We think there are a lot of signals out there. We have to learn what they are through experimentation and how to use them. So back to Iceland for a minute. Sheer coincidence, but they happen to have very picturesque waterfalls. Any old-time techies remember the waterfall method in software development? Right? You spend a year gathering requirements and a year doing your design and a year building your software, and then you roll it out, and nobody wants that anymore because you haven't talked to your customer in 3 years. About 10 years ago, everybody started to shift toward different kinds of methods. For example, the agile method, where you include your customer in the process and you add a couple of features every week and you do very tight little iterations. And at the end, you've still taken 3 years and you've still spent $10 million, but you have a product that you have a market for because the customer's been with you all the way. Our challenge in international development is we're still doing waterfall. We're using 3-year-old data to make 5-year plans. So we think there's a new opportunity here to harness the phenomenon of big data in real time to give us real-time feedback on where things aren't working so we can take rapid action to fix it. Of course, getting the data, figuring out how to analyze it, and producing incontrovertible evidence that something important is happening is only half the challenge. How do you actually get an institution to use it? Institutions are not set up to make use of real-time data in many cases, but there's some great examples. This is one. This is from U.S. Geological Survey. They have something they call TED, which is their Twitter earthquake detector. They monitor Twitter in multiple languages for reports of earthquakes. And they've got false positives below 10% now. It's pretty good. It caught the earthquake in the Philippines a few weeks back, I think in 5 seconds. Right? But what's interesting here is how they use this internally, because they don't declare an earthquake when TED picks up an earthquake. What they do is wake up the seismologist in that part of the world and say, go check your seismographic sensor data. Right? What that allows them to do is reduce the time it takes to pinpoint the epicenter of the quake from 20 minutes down to 3 or 4. So this is not a replacement for hard scientific data. It's a complement, and it's an accelerator. And we've been working with the UN and with governments to try to get them to understand that this data is not replacing their statistics, but it's going to provide a tremendous advantage by getting you to action faster. There are challenges out there, though. When we talk to, if you talk to an astrophysicist, they'll tell you most of the universe is invisible. Right? It's only the 4% that's actual matter that shines back at you through a telescope. We think there's an analogous situation out there in the world of big data. Yes, there's a lot of public open data on the open web, for example, but some of the most valuable real-time data is being collected behind firewalls by companies as consumers use their services. And it's not being shared. It's being used by these companies as a business asset so they can compete in the market. The problem is that this data is probably the single best lens through which to understand what is happening to people in 2012. So we've begun engaging with companies around the world who have very interesting data around a concept called data philanthropy. The basic idea is pretty straightforward. Can we work together to find a way for you to share some of the data that powers your business so that it can be used to understand what's happening to populations? Not the raw data. That would put you out of business, and you have to protect individual privacy. But aggregated data, scrubbed data. Perhaps it means sharing data into a public commons of some kind, where that of your data is combined with that of your competition, so no one can see whose customers those are. And this is where we think we need to head. Can you imagine a world in which we actually have the private sector sharing data into an open data commons? Now, why would they want to do that? Well, when we talk to these companies, especially those that invest in emerging markets, they're excited about the idea of a data philanthropy as a novel form of corporate social responsibility. That's cool. They get the power of data. They would like to help. But if it's your customers who are in danger of falling back into poverty in one of these countries, there goes your market. And if it turns out that there's a way for them to share data collectively, sharing the risk with that of their competitors in a given country in a way that can be used to help public policy intervene when the rains come late and when food prices go up. This is a kind of business risk insurance that you pay for with data. So we now have a number of organizations that are offering to work with us in sharing some of this data for research purposes. Here's an example of a kind of classic Global Pulse project. We're in discussions now with mobile carrier Orange in Senegal, looking at the drought that hit the Sahel in Africa in 2011. Everyone says there's a drought coming. No one does anything. A lot of people die. In 2012, a year late, a response is mobilized. We think that this was a real opportunity lost because we think that there were signals that could have provided much harder evidence of how the population was being affected back in 2011. So the idea here is pretty straightforward. Let's get all the variables we can out of 2011 Orange data from Senegal, and let's do the mother of all regressions against it, against rainfall levels. Right? When the rains don't come, do you see anomalous population movements? Can you see people migrating? Can you see them suddenly having less money to spend on communications? Can you see bursts of calls between the capital, where people have jobs and resources, and nomadic populations in rural areas? If this turns out to be effective, what we're talking about here is the 1,000+ mobile carriers in the world sitting on what are essentially drought impact sensors that are not being leveraged. We'd love to build a tool that makes this possible for any carrier to plug directly into their network and generate real-time heat maps of impact. Global Pulse is implementing the project by going to the field through what are called PulseLabs. PulseLabs are physical facilities. They're joint research initiatives between government and the United Nations and partners at the country level, where data scientists and engineers and policy experts work on R&D projects together. We recognize pretty quick, that's why we're at Strata, that we may have expertise in nutrition and education and food security. We do not have data mining expertise. That's with you guys. That's in the private sector. That's in academia. So the idea is to form partnerships outside of the system that can help us get this expertise, get access to the data, get access to these cutting-edge technologies, and start applying them as a public good. The goal is to implement a network of labs around the world, only as many as it takes, until we see this taking off. Our role is really to act as an accelerator to build the strategic relationships and the understanding of how this data can be used, and get things to the point that we're seeing mass adoption begin to snowball. First lab just launched in Indonesia, in Jakarta, PulseLab Jakarta. We're planning to open a second lab early next year in Uganda. The modality is pretty simple. We partner with government to establish labs. We build a world-class team with local knowledge. We partner with private sector who have the tools and expertise. Then we work with UN agencies and academia to design and conduct research projects going after some of these hard challenges. When we find something that works, we turn it into an open source prototype that can automate the analysis, help the national institutions, local NGOs, and communities figure out how they can make best use of these capabilities, and share what we learn. There are ways for you to get involved. We cannot do this without you. If you're a company with interesting data, we would love to work with you. Have you explored, how people change the way they use these services you make available when their household needs change? If you'd like to work with us on analyzing your data, and it could be your data scientists who work with us to design an experiment, but you're the only ones who touch the data, this is an option for collaboration. Do you have tools? Do you have storage? Do you have compute? Would you like to see how your analytics could be used to generate real-time evidence that something important is happening in the world? We would love to work with you. Frankly, we'd love to use your tools publicly to take on global challenges. And if you are able to make them available to us, we can partner to demonstrate how these kinds of capabilities could change the work of the public sector around the world. Do you want to get personally involved? Are you a data scientist who's interested in doing something with high impact in a field where there haven't been a lot of opportunities for data scientists to date? Again, we'd love to work with you. There are great organizations like DataKind, for example. We can work together to match you with a UN agency like UNICEF or World Food Program to work on a project in an interesting part of the world in health or education or poverty. Or are you someone who's thinking carefully about data privacy and big data? Because again, we need your help here as well. There's a lot of potential, there's a lot of risk. So PulseLab Jakarta is now up and running. We just launched on 1 October. Very exciting work. We had a launch event with about 300 people, and we're absolutely floored at how many different organizations there are doing analytics. Lots and lots of interest, but again, there's a lot of social media content there, and 11 mobile carriers. It's a complex ecosystem. Here you can see some of the research that we started doing early on back in June in Indonesia using Crimson Hexagon's platform, looking at the tofu and tempeh crisis in Indonesia. You may not be aware of this, but there was one because of the drought in the U.S. We saw soybean supplies plummet, which sent prices of tofu and tempeh very, very high, and people panicked. Now, you remember the shot I showed you of Ramadan, that there's this spike in food-related conversation every Ramadan. That's over on the right. That little bump is part of your baseline, but this is what a real crisis looks like. Interestingly, back in April, the government was planning to cut fuel subsidies. So this was going to send the price of fuel 30% higher. The food-related conversation we see through social media in Indonesia is comparable to that as when food prices themselves went up. People are acutely aware that if fuel prices go up, that will also make it impossible for them to feed their families. We've also been working with SAS's platform, both the social media analytics platform, Text Miner, and their visual analytics for doing correlation analysis. The basic concept here is there are about 200,000 new social media documents every day in the Bahasa language that need to be analyzed. So going through and filtering, using keywords to find relevant content is the first step. Next, we perform sentiment and mood scoring on the content to detect trends in mood around those different types of conversations. Finally, going through and looking at location, extracting information about prices where they're actually being mentioned, and then looking to correlate those trends over time with official statistics, right? Can we use this data to predict official statistics? We're starting to be able to. This is very crude. A lot more refinement is needed here. But we've seen several different keywords with combinations of sentiment that begin to predict the official food price inflation. Now, the odd bit is eggs. We actually see a negative correlation there. Very strange. You would think, as Indonesians eat a lot of eggs, and you would think as egg prices go up, people will be complaining more that the price of eggs are going up, and they would be expressing concern about that. When we actually went in and looked at the data, we found that there were plenty of those tweets, for example. There are plenty of those messages, but for every one of those, there were 10 others where people were saying, I had the yummiest omelet for breakfast this morning. Indonesians are really into eggs. Don't understand it, but basically what it means is when you see lots of tweets about eggs, it's a good thing, not a bad thing. But does that work in Bali or only in Java? Right? I think there's a point here, which is that a lot of the signals you're going to be looking for in this data are culturally contextual. We imagine at some point there will be map layers of proxy indicators of different things that are actually happening offline. Some are universal, some will be very specific. But what is interesting is that Indonesians have been changing how they use social media. That you see this huge explosion at the beginning of this year in conversations about food and food security. Okay, so there's a lot more of this kind of signal out there. What does that mean? Well, when we take this crude index that we developed and compare it to the official food price statistics, right around the end of last year, beginning of this year, you start to see correlations emerge. If we tried this 2 years ago, it wouldn't have worked. But we believe that because more people are actually using social media to talk about basic needs, you're now starting to see stronger correlations with official statistics. So what's coming next? We're in discussions with mobile carriers there to get access to anonymized call-to-tail records and airtime purchases. That's not humongous data, but it's pretty big data. I don't have a server that big, but we will. Again, 170 million subscribers, lots of information. So today I can go to any of 100 different websites and type in my zip code, and I can get access to 3 types of information. I can get real-time sensor feeds. Weather data is ambient. Right? I can get wind speed, I can get wind direction, temperature, etc. Those data streams feed predictive models continuously that allow me to see out to 5 or 10 days what the weather is likely to be. And finally, there are algorithms always running looking for concerning patterns in radar images like swirling clouds. And we think that the kind of socioeconomic indicators that are out there in this data will eventually, because they must, become ambient data as well. If we can realize the vision of a real-time public-private sector data commons, if we can learn how to do this analysis, if we can make the tools open source and available for communities to use, or at least the services, we think there's a huge opportunity here to essentially have socioeconomic weather stations, where it should be possible to see what the current trends are in health and poverty and education in any community in the world. Thanks very much.